Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. We're so excited to share the power of healing from complex trauma with all of you. It's inspiring to know that so many of you tune in to learn about how healing from complex trauma is possible. Are you interested in deepening your understanding of NARM? We're excited to present The Inner Circle, NARM's online learning community. Each month, members receive direct mentorship from NARM creator Dr. Lawrence Heller, NARM training director Brad Kammer, and other NARM faculty as they present NARM demonstration sessions and provide extensive debriefs on applying NARM with real clients. They also present live topic webinars that deconstruct the various elements of complex trauma. Members also get access to archived material and other learning resources, as well as access to a private Facebook group with other professionals learning NARM around the world. The Inner Circle is a hub for the international NARM community where people working with complex trauma come together to connect, network, and develop trauma-informed projects to help our world. You, our Transforming Trauma listeners, can receive a free 14-day trial with access to the 3-month archive by visiting www.narmtraining.com/free trial. And now for our interview. Philip Tedeschi studies and teaches on the intricate relationship between people, domestic and wild animals, and the natural world. He received his MSSW degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where his specialization was the bio-affiliative connection between people and animals. Tedeschi is the executive director of the Institute for Human-Animal Connection and a clinical professor at the University of Denver Graduate School of Social Work. He is globally recognized for expertise in the clinical methods of animal-assisted interventions, human-animal interaction and conflict, and coordinates the school's animal-assisted social work certificate program for Master of Social Work students, as well as professional development programs. Please enjoy this conversation with Philip Tedeschi. All right, I'm sitting here with Philip Tedeschi. Thank you so much for coming to Transforming Trauma. We're happy to have you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
So I would love for listeners to hear from you on a question that we often ask our guests here, or all the time we ask this question. And that is, what is it that you would like listeners to get out of our interview today?
Well, there's, lots of things I suppose I would love to have your listeners learn about the nature of my work. But I probably would say maybe the most important takeaway is that our treatment of other non-human animals turns out to be a very significant issue for our own health and mental health. And in the course of the work that I've done, I've come to really appreciate this much more nuanced and intricate understanding of how people and non-human animals are connected to one another. And there's many examples of that, but I think that's really the biggest takeaway from the animals that we live in, our companion animals in our home, to the animals that we see less frequently or maybe often don't even notice at all. All of them are relevant for this, important consideration for how we treat them in terms and recognizing that we're connected to them in that way.
Great. That's a beautiful place to start. So if you could share with listeners, just tell us about the work that you're doing in the field and how maybe that relates to trauma.
Sure. We could maybe start with the current and work backwards or the other way around. But I've been a clinical professor in a graduate school of social work at the University of Denver for about 25 years. I'm also a clinical social worker by profession and have been a psychotherapist for longer than that, so close to 30 years. And much of my work has focused on interventions or clinical work with at-risk populations, persons that we would describe as having, unique challenges. And often what we have found in the context of the work that I've done is that traditional approaches to intervention, clinical intervention, in many cases fall short of our goals. And I became interested in experiential therapy early on in my career, and it has taken kind of, a central role in the ways I've approached doing my work. And so now we've, moved that question to a academic setting. So now we're teaching new social workers, the next generation of clinicians, about how to incorporate animals into complex clinical settings and why we do that and how we do that, both ethically and safely. So that's really the kind of the broad brush of my work. And, I think one of the interesting questions that has come out of this is, not simply how it presents in a clinical setting, but how does it also present in our everyday lives? Because people and animals often have relationships already with each other. For example, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of, 300 million companion animals living in people's homes just here in the United States. How do those relationships relate to our sense of well-being and our own sense of health? And so we're looking at almost every aspect of the human-animal connection, including connections that we would say would be problematic. So we're also interested in where does this go wrong and in what ways are we challenged or maybe mistreating or not treating animals properly, and what's the impact of those interactions as well. So we've been studying really all of it for quite some time.
I appreciate that. And one thing, when I was just looking through some of your work, I think it's a quote that you said, something to the effect of that when we promote healthy human and animal relationships, that we improve outcomes for both. And that really jumped out at me. I guess I've never really thought about it being so bidirectional. So I'm excited to hear more about your thoughts on that.
There is I would say for quite some time now, a new appreciation for these special connections. And we might also want to even include nature, or sometimes what we think of as kind of our ecological living systems or ecosystem services. So in my studies as I became interested in this, I actually started in vet school, ended up leaving vet school, realizing that what I was more interested in than just animal medicine was really the relationship between people and non-human animals. And at the time, telling my advisor what I wanted to do, he immediately said, no, don't do that. There wasn't really a field of study. Now there are entire academic programs dedicated to anthrozoology, human-animal interaction studies, critical animal studies, and also kind of maybe most importantly, a relatively new terminology that's being applied is One Health, or even some people call it One Medicine, that emanates from the language used to study humans and their relationship to non-humans. And largely that had been a veterinary term describing things like disease transmission between non-human animals and people. But increasingly, it's being used to just simply describe the intersectionality between people, animals, and the environment. And that as we've started to study those, we've had revealed to us, probably shouldn't be as surprising as it is to many of us, but that we, are on the same road, that when we see challenges to non-human animals and elements that, place their well-being in harm's way, that often we also see people in very similar circumstances living alongside them. Or, conversely, maybe the environment. What happens when we damage the environment? How consequential is it to non-human animals and to humans? And what we're finding is these are very intersected, and there's lots of good examples we're all living through right now. Things like climate change issues, all kinds of global health considerations, including the pandemic itself, would fall into that category.
Right. I'm kind of holding that right now. Just, hearing you talk about it, it brings up for me just in NARM, the concept, well, not just in NARM, but the concept of connection, and how when we're disconnected from ourselves, we can become disconnected from our environment, from animals. And I also want to just highlight, I appreciate that there's a differentiation there of non-human animals. And I'm guessing, is it safe to kind of draw a line there of that the humans are animals? There's non-human animals and then there's human animals.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, we kind of forget, right, sometimes that we're in this together and that we're also animals. And we have been probably taught, maybe intentionally or unintentionally somehow, that humans are different or superior or in some way or another, unique. And the reality is, that every species has capabilities that make them unique and special, including humans. But that to a large degree, what I think we're, trying to get people to think about here is what do we share in common? And so my studies was referred to, the name of my, my academic studies was what I called bio-affiliation, or really our connection or affiliation with the living world. And I've spent most of my academic career looking at that and studying that and developing an institute that has explored all aspects of that issue. And as a clinician, I've utilized that relationship to intentionally and strategically to incorporate animals for the purpose of improving human health. And so I was, thrilled to get your invitation to come on your program, in part because the title of your program is the exact same title as my book called Transforming Trauma. And there's some, exciting developments that have come out of this exploration that I hope people will be interested in. And I think many people, it'll resonate for them that, for many people probably listening to this, some of their most reliable relationships that they have every day may be with a non-human, may be with, the animals that they live with and that they look forward to getting home at the end of the day because their greeting, getting home is so special and so unique, and that these are important relationships, partially because they're so reliable and so trustworthy.
If it's okay, I can talk about, before we pressed record, I was sharing with you, as I was looking through just a little bit of your work already, I had kind of personal things popping up for me about how this would be important for me to learn more about, just because of other relationships that I have where I know this has been really important for them and also for me in my own life. I'm a cat mom, so I've got some really important animals in my life that have been very supportive. So I appreciate that you're highlighting that. Some of our most constant, reliable relationships are with the non-human animals. So
yeah, no doubt about it. Yeah, I sometimes have been caught saying, that people, the human animal has in some ways become quite lazy communicators compared to many non-human animals, where we've evolved in such a direction that we rely very heavily on linguistics, just, language in one form or another, emails or text or spoken language. Our non-human animal companions are relying on everything but those as strategies for communicating. So you may have had this experience yourself where, for example, when you're struggling or feeling, sometimes it's elated. Sometimes our animals will react to us when we're in really positive moods, but often they pick up on dysphoria or any kind of really significant changes in our moods, often more quickly than the humans in our home. And as a result, they'll come sit next to us or get right close to us or lean into us, and our well-being matters to them. And as we'll talk about today, some of the most significant takeaways from this examination is really that connection, how that connection occurs and what happens once we are connected in terms of how that improves our own capabilities for health.
I'm having some emotion come up as you share about that. With the pandemic, and a lot of my clients now are virtual, and I'm just thinking about how supportive it's been. Oftentimes I have my cat sitting right next to me. So it's like I feel this kind of connection, when I have a client sharing something maybe kind of heavy, I feel like I've got my cat there kind of helping me ground. I don't know if that's pertinent to share, but it feels...
It is pertinent, and it's also not your imagination that's improving your sense of well-being. One of maybe the single biggest takeaway from the research and the book, Transforming Trauma, its subtitle is Resilience and Healing Through Our Connection with Animals. The single biggest takeaway has been this recognition that the well-being of the animal that's sitting right next to us or right, within our own kind of visual immediate environment has direct impact on our own interpersonal neurobiology. And so when your cat comes in, just as it did when we started, and sits on your lap and leans into you or starts purring, or you're starting to put your hands on them and engaging in this, quiet and rhythmic petting of them, what that does is that's changing your brain chemistry, and in ways that are quite important for on many different aspects of our functioning, but from a clinical perspective, it's very important for our ability to get well. So our brain, especially when we've experienced trauma and, let's say, environments or settings that have exposed us to life-threatening circumstances or significant trauma, our brains accommodate that in a particular way. And one of the challenges, and this is really almost the perfect definition of PTSD that our service members would have experienced, is that their brains have been trained to be in a different environment and to function in a combat environment or a threatening environment. And then when they get back home, let's say, and they're sitting at the kitchen table in the morning eating their Cheerios, how is their brain functioning then? It turns out that can be really difficult and problematic because their brain is not regulating for now being back home in a safe environment. When we're in the presence of other living systems that are also thriving, flourishing, doing well or comfortable or calm, our ability to recognize that pre-consciously, it's what we call neuroception of safety. So this would be almost before you're thinking about threat or safety, before you could put it into words or put it even into a thought. You're taking in that information by observing and experiencing the living parts of your environment. Now, your office chair wouldn't provide you that information, right? Or your TV probably wouldn't, especially these days. But your relaxed companion animal sitting on your lap is doing that. And that neuroception of safety alters your brain chemistry. And what it does is it activates the oxytocin system. It almost immediately engages your entire system through what we call the polyvagal system. And you would see changes in that. For example, you would feel almost immediately more relaxed, more comfortable, probably more social, more trusting, more talkative. We've seen, for example, in the presence of a safe therapeutic animal, many clients will talk almost twice as much in a clinical environment with the presence of a safe animal there. And so when I'm working with clients that, almost by definition don't trust people, my ideal circumstance for doing that work is when I could have an animal, a safe animal, a trusting animal, a calm animal join me in that environment, because what I'm trying to do is to have them reevaluate me as a support system for them or as a therapist by utilizing this system of neuroceptive safety to alter their brain functioning. And almost every single time, within a minute or two, that person is, starting to talk. They might start out with something like, "What's that dog's name?" Or, "What is your cat's name?" Or, "I used to have cats." And that is an invitation, though, to connect with you as the practitioner, and you go from there, right? And so you have these opportunities, I think, to really do work in ways that are hard to do without animals present.
Yeah. And now I'm looking back and thinking about how those kinds of questions of like, "Oh, you have a cat. I used to have a cat." And it kind of starts this just organic conversation. And I can really see how there's an opening, kind of a heart opening of a little bit more trust. Like, oh, if her cat would jump on her lap, maybe she's trustworthy. I don't know that that's conscious that they're thinking that, but.
Yeah, no, that's totally right. And not only is that accurate, but it makes perfect sense. Why would your cat want to be sitting next to you if you were a dangerous person or were unsafe to them? So what they're showing you, most importantly, but your client also increasingly, this is giving them pretty valuable information about, well, at least somebody in this room really trusts you. Maybe I should be able to do that, and that becomes really important. We found that to be, I would say, almost critical for when we work with children who have experienced early trauma at the hands of caregivers, especially people they should have been able to trust and didn't. Often those individuals don't have a framework for who they can trust or who they can't trust. And so this is very relevant and useful information for them to build confidence in their counselor or their therapist. But this is happening on natural levels as well. Things like how many people, for example, know the name of their neighbor's dog before they know the name of their neighbor. how much more likely are you to talk to somebody walking a happy-go-lucky dog down the sidewalk than somebody who's hustling with their head down and isn't looking at you, right? And those sorts of things. So basic experiment I do with my students just to make this point is I'll hand one of my students the leash of the dog that works with me at the university and just ask them to walk across campus. And then I will have them walk that same route without a dog present. And, it literally takes the person with a dog about twice as long to get across campus because they have to stop. They talk to, twice as many people. People tell them about their dogs. They're homesick because they haven't seen their dogs. All this stuff and the person who's walking without that often has no interactions or very few. It's like, excuse me, or maybe if they see somebody they know. But these are quite different circumstances in which to function. So we can use them in clinical environments, but they're happening all around us. And we sometimes refer to this as social capital, the dimension under which we are likely to have greater social interaction or relationships with others. Those are directly related to human health.
Wow. I wonder if we could rewind just a little bit. If you could tell us a little bit more. I know you said you were in veterinary school and you moved into this field. Can you tell us a little bit more about what caused that shift? I wonder if you could expand on that.
I sometimes feel so fortunate because I've had just this amazing journey through my career. So what was happening at that time, I was wanting, or what I thought I wanted to be a large animal veterinarian. And I knew quite a lot more about animals at that time than I did about people. And one of my jobs, I worked in the large animal veterinary hospital as a student veterinary technician, was to manage the horse program at the university, and was asked on kind of a given day, a random ask of, would I teach a group of adults that had schizophrenia how to ride horses? And, I think I was maybe 23 at the time and quite ambitious, probably didn't know better. Luckily, I didn't, get anyone hurt, but I immediately said, sure, yeah, I'll do that. And the day arrived where this group of newly deinstitutionalized adults arrived on a bus. They climbed off the bus, were engaging in all kinds of quite unusual, very institutional behaviors. Even the horses were a little bit, nervous about what they were looking at. And almost like right before my eyes, I started to observe these individuals starting to change. That instead of this highly anxious, what we sometimes call self-stimulation behaviors, like moving back and forth, doing, strange movements, making strange noises, they started to relax and calm down. And as they started to interact with the horses, particularly once they started grooming the horses and, using a soft brush to run down the horse's side or being able to put their hands on the horse, this coherence, this sense that the person could adopt the status of the animal that they're interacting with. So you saw people start to breathe differently. They started, to interact with me and others differently, started to be more verbal. And almost right in front of my eyes, I would just say, what on earth? This is pretty amazing. Even the staff members who accompanied these individuals had this reaction. And so this is really what, for me, changed my mind about what I wanted to do. I realized that I was more interested in that than just learning about animal medicine. And at the time, this field was not quite as developed. This was over 30 years ago now. The one person who I knew from just having read her work that was doing very interesting work was Dr. Jane Goodall. And she was doing this work in Gombe National Park, studying the cognitive and emotional lives of chimpanzees in Tanzania. And I contacted her, and to my surprise, she responded and agreed to be supportive, help kind of convince my school that I should be allowed to do this, because we didn't have a program that, really focused in this area. And ultimately, it allowed me to write my own program. It was called an independent major focused on bio-affiliation. And that's what I've done ever since. And maybe one of the biggest honors in my life was to contribute a chapter to Dr. Jane's 80th birthday book that many of her mentees put together. My chapter is called Waking with a Smile, that describes how fortunate I was to run into her and be able to do this work as my job and my career, because I spend all my time with students and animals, really, and it's been amazing. So that's kind of how I got started in this. But quite soon after that, as I'm trying to figure out where do you land this interest, what discipline or what field of study most best captures this. And what I concluded was that social work was the best fit for me, because social work uses the theory base, or maybe the most common theory base that social workers will use, is what they sometimes call person and environment, or even sometimes ecological systems theory. And what they're talking about there is that we study people in the context of the relationships that they have. And that when social workers choose to intervene in a person's life, we almost always start by trying to build support systems in and around that individual as a way to improve their lives or their health. And what the research is now showing us, that now, it's taken a long time to be able to say this, but that it turns out that our support systems don't have to be other humans. They can be non-humans, and that these relationships are just as important, not better. I always try to caution people to not allow themselves to do like, I love animals more than people, or, compare them to one another. We probably need both. But it's kind of remarkable that when we open that door and realize it doesn't just have to be human beings that provide support, then it brings up these bigger questions about how do we relate to the living world, to other non-human animals, and what's the significance of that? How should that shape our understanding of this particular capability that animals have? And what's our responsibility back to them? Because I think these are the kinds of things that have significant implications today about how we should be thinking about animal protection as well.
Can you speak more to that, the animal protection part?
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually become probably, in some ways, the most immediate focus that I have right now, is that we are really exploring the importance of our relationships with animals that are probably less visible to us in everyday terms. So many people think of their companion animals as close companions or even members of their family. We have reason to believe from studies, for example, that children who grow up with companion animals often see them as siblings. Some of their earliest reciprocal play, for example, might not be with a human, but it might be with an animal that they're playing with. And many of us would probably agree that our companion animals are members of our family, that we love having them with us. We have good evidence that families are happier, or some of their happiest times and activities are involved not their companion animals. But then it kind of forces the question, what about the other animals that are in our world? What we would consider wildlife. How do we feel about those animals? And what should our relationship be with those animals? And what about farmed animals? And what should our relationship be with animals that are largely just seen through the lens of our food systems? What about the animals we never see? Things like insect lives or birds that, are, flying through, but now have had significant pressures on them. And what I've come to believe is that these are not irrelevant to the planet's current condition, that largely when we engage in harm to living systems, there are direct implications, that cruelty is almost never without consequences to our own society, to our own communities and families. And I literally have just almost endless examples of that phenomenon, but it invites us to rethink our relationship with other animals. And, might we consider a time when animals have greater legal standing and greater legal positioning in our society? Currently in the United States, animals are considered to have the same status as, the shoes that you're wearing on your feet. They're property. And as a result, almost anything we want to do with them, we can do with them because of that condition. This is familiar territory in some ways, right? There's been times in our history where we've viewed certain people, enslaved persons, for example, as property who didn't have the ability to, let's say, bring a court case on their own behalf because they weren't seen as people. They were not legal people, and legal people can't actually bring a court case to share their grievance in, let's say, in relation to their captivity. And that's true for animals as well. We have cases like Happy the elephant at the Bronx Zoo that has, lived most of its life in a solitary cage. One of the most social animals in the world is the elephant. And because it's property, it allows the keepers of that particular animal to keep them any way they choose to, as long as they're meeting kind of the most basic requirements under the Animal Welfare Act. Everything else is fair game. And so I believe there'll be a day where we look back to this stage and realize that we would be better off as a society to dramatically, revisit this concept of how we want to relate to other animals and the living world. And that would improve almost every aspect of our lives.
I appreciate you highlighting that, because I'm just sitting here thinking, okay, we know the animals in our environment, like they're supportive to us. I mean, even just like our companion animals, like you highlighted. And so when we're mistreating these non-human animals, that ultimately there's this bidirectional support, or hopefully there would be, that we're hurting ourselves too, is what I'm hearing. The consequences aren't just for the animals. The consequences, we feel those consequences as well. Just like when we don't respect and then we damage our environment, we ultimately are going to also reap consequences there.
No doubt about it. In fact, we even know what some of those are. For example, in children, if we look at this through the lens of child development, what we know is that children that are exposed to cruelty, human or non-human, almost by necessity have to develop defense mechanisms that establish kind of the basis for callous and unemotional traits in that individual in order to just survive. Another way to say that, the simple way to say that would be, you just can't afford to have feelings because it's too difficult, too painful. So if you grow somebody up in an environment where feelings are not safe to have, what happens to them? And what are the repercussions of growing up having less and less capacity to feel, less and less capacity for empathy? And really where this probably plays out in maybe the most significance is this idea of the new science of what we call animal sentience. And sentience is a word that many people recognize and know, but it basically refers to the capacity to have a wide range of feelings. And we now know, without real scientific question mark at this point, that non-human animals are sentient beings, that they have feelings comparable to our own, that they love their children, they have reactions to being separated from them, that they can feel joy, they can feel wonder, they can feel sadness and grief. One of the amazing opportunities I've had over the last about decade and a half is teaching a course in East Africa, where one of the elements of that program has been to meet orphaned elephants of poaching incidents where they've lost their family members. And most elephants, female elephants, live their entire lives with their mothers and aunties and sisters. They never are separated from them throughout the course of their life. So when they lose these relationships through these violent events, about half of these orphans, even though we know exactly how to feed them, what they need kind of physically, about half of these orphans will die from grief. This, capacity for their ability to overcome this dramatic trauma is just too much for them. And so that, I think is an interesting and maybe harsh example, though, of the fact that we're not the only sentient beings on the planet, right? There's other non-human animals that have just the same capacity for these as we do. And this is being played out all around us. And we might even, I often wonder, whether all of us are at risk of becoming callous and unemotional to some degree when we see things like, we may not even recognize it as these kinds of incidents, but things like bulldozing a piece of ground for a development where you see an entire prairie dog colony disappear. Is that an example of a problem for us? Or does it matter? Should we have any reaction or emotion to that? Or when we see ecosystems or the ocean or our forests or farmed animals kept in, these incredibly abusive, large factory farming environments, I think those are often out of sight, but are they really out of mind? And I suspect that our society is struggling with finding this way forward here. And I try to stay optimistic about it and view it as an opportunity for us to improve our health and build healthier families and societies. But we have a lot of work to do.
Gosh, I had like 3 stories come to my mind as you were talking, just kind of connecting dots in my own life of how this really is showing up and how I know in my own life, I really have felt the effects of that. Like I grew up out in the desert, running barefoot in the desert. I was a young and adult, in my early 20s, they cleared a lot of that land and to build homes. And I know my heart grieved that. Like it was really sad for me. I'm even feeling it right now as I'm thinking about it. It was really sad to watch the desert just cleared because I did think about all the animals that had to leave and where did they go? I don't even know where they went. Really sad.
It's interesting that you bring up that example. There's a term that was coined by I think he was Australian sociologist, a man named Glenn Albrecht. And he uses this term called solastalgia. And solastalgia, he defines as seeing the places, the living places that we're connected to, harmed in one form or another, sometimes disappeared entirely. Lots of people have this experience, for example, when they realize their favorite tree that they climbed as a kid has been removed or cut down or something like that. But your story is a perfect example for that. And he actually will say it feels like being homesick even when you're home.
Yes.
Well, all of us have probably experienced homesickness at one point or another. But what happens when that is still a feeling you have when you're still living in that place or visiting that place? And more people have experienced that. And I think it could be attributable, or it could be one of the explanations for why we see things like extensive challenges with things like the opioid epidemic. Why would we have a national addiction to painkillers, on that scale? Why are people in so much pain? What is it that would cause them to not want to feel? I think we need to look closer to home to these systems that are being routinely undermined. And I think climate change is the other. We know that lots of young people are experiencing eco-anxiety related mental health concerns because they just don't know what the future will hold for them. And it's hard to imagine that it's going to be better. So I think those are real issues that are now being treated as part of our everyday mental health problems that we're encountering.
Yeah, I really appreciate you talking about that. I didn't know there was a name for it. What did you call it again? What was it, the term?
Solastalgia. Solastalgia. So it would be similar to the word of nostalgia, but soul meaning ill. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting term. If you search that term, you'd find quite a lot of exploration about it. And it definitely speaks to our broader global health and conservation initiatives. One of the examples that I like to give of that I think has been pertinent here in Colorado, where I live, has been the temptation that people have to kind of want things their way. So we've had Canadian geese, who are a migratory species protected by the Migratory Bird Acts in the United States, but there have been cities that have found that these birds now sometimes stop and will stay in parks where they are not always welcome because they'll poop on the sidewalk or on the grass. And yet we've built these parks to have ponds, the kind of grass that they love, almost the perfect habitat for them to raise their families. And as our weather has gotten warmer, they don't have to fly as far south to find suitable environments to live in. And as a result, though, now they're in conflict with persons who share the park. So it becomes this interesting question of, do we want parks that are only for people? Because what we've done is gotten in the business of, at times, forcibly removing these animals from these places. Those are what we sometimes call a human-animal conflict, but are also important to look at because they define the kinds of relationship we'll have with other non-humans. And it's quite frequent that our own wildlife services and the federal organizations, the state organizations that are designated to respond to human-animal conflict often approach these with lethal outcomes to the animals involved. And it becomes, I think, a real question. Maybe it solves the problem. Scientifically, probably it suggests it doesn't, because if you remove 100 geese, it makes room for 100 more. So we don't typically actually solve the problem that way. But I think kind of the bigger question I'm getting at here is that the kind of relationship we're going to have with animals as we find ourselves inconvenienced by the fact that they're living there as well? And these kinds of things are happening all around us. And our youth are growing up in these environments. And every day, most of us encounter one aspect of this or another.
I appreciate that question. Is that the kind of relationship that we're going to have? I'm kind of holding that right now, just thinking about all the ways, thinking of my part in this. Yeah, thank you for that.
There's a lot of soul searching and self-examination that we need to do. And it's not always convenient to start to care about these issues. I appreciate that. That is, these are hard issues, not always with easy solutions, but ignoring them, it doesn't serve us well. I think they're important conversations for us to have, especially in these kind of spaces where we're really talking about health, human health and human well-being. Do these things matter? And my work has suggested that they are critical, that they're some of the most important issues facing us at this time. Planetary health issues may be, one of our most urgent considerations at this stage.
Certainly. Well, thank you so much, Philip. I wondered if there was anything else that you feel like you would like listeners to know about the work that you've done and what you've learned.
Well, I just wanted to share maybe just one brief, this is dialing back to earlier in our conversation, but as we start to think about interventions for persons who have experienced trauma, one of the, and maybe as the takeaway or kind of the simple version of what I would like people to know, is that if we elevate animals so that they're doing well, so that they're flourishing around us, then often our interactions in and around those animals, including incorporating them into complex clinical environments, things like trauma-based environments. And my work has looked at this through the lens of crisis intervention, things like school shootings, child maltreatment, post-traumatic stress, and things like our service members. That what we really want to concentrate on when we're incorporating animals into those settings is the well-being of the animal and ensuring that these interactions are being done with the animal's well-being, often front and center. And it should make kind of common sense when you spend a little bit of time observing. If an animal was in distress, being in their immediate environment is often stressful for the persons as well. But when we're in the presence of animals that are flourishing, we have this capacity for these various improvements of our health. And there are protocols that allow us to do this more strategically with best practices. We, for example, see, in the United States, every state in the United States now has prison dog programs as a way of beginning to influence the condition of incarcerated persons' experiences. Those are only going to be beneficial if, in fact, those animals, in fact, are really flourishing, right? Things like that. So I think that's maybe my parting thought, was just to invite people to start to learn about species-specific welfare. What does your dog need to have its best life? What does your cat need to have its best life? When you do that, you will find that improves your well-being simultaneously.
Well, thank you for that. That's a nice way for us all to kind of come away from this conversation of what is my part in this? How does this relate to me and in my life? So I appreciate that, Philip. How can listeners kind of come in contact with your work? How can they, I know you have a book. Can you share more about how we can learn more?
If you look under my name and Transforming Trauma, it's published by Purdue Press. It's also available at most of the booksellers that you would utilize. It's a great edited volume of multiple different chapters that are looking at different perspectives on this. You can also go to our website at the Graduate School of Social Work at the University of Denver and the Institute for Human-Animal Connection. That is an institution that supports the education of students in our program, but it's also a research institution doing some very exciting research in these areas of both the human health aspects, but also community health and broader One Health considerations. And an exciting new development is we also are connecting this to other disciplines. So our Graduate School of Professional Psychology, our animal law program are beginning to work in this area of animal sentience and supporting greater attention to the rights of animals or the legal standing of animals, and hope that you'll consider learning more about that and joining our effort to begin to move the needle on this. I think there's lots of ways that everyday persons can begin to do that, even if it's something as simple as learning about the species-specific needs of things like your dogs and bringing those into your home, teaching your children about those and encouraging your family members to appreciate those areas of knowledge. And that's kind of how we have to do this, kind of person by person, relationship by relationship. And, it may sound like hard work, but I want to tell people that it's actually just the opposite. It makes your life better, you're richer. All of a sudden, you're not alone with just the human animals on the planet, but there's many other relationships to have. I consider many animals some of my best friends.
Great. Thank you so much. And we'll put those links in the show notes. And thank you again, Philip, for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. I look forward to staying in touch, and please feel free to reach out to me. You can find me at the University of Denver's Graduate School of Social Work.
Great. Thanks again.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. Are you interested in deepening your understanding of NARM? We're excited to present The Inner Circle, NARM's online learning community. Each month, members receive direct mentorship from NARM creator Dr. Lawrence Heller and NARM training director Brad Kammer, access to NARM demonstrations with extensive debriefs, and the opportunity to engage with the Hub for the International NARM community. Dive in with a free 14-day trial and access the 3-month archive by visiting www.narmtraining.com/free trial. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community, connection with you, and changing the world by transforming trauma.